Welcome everyone to this webinar on leading well in times of stress and fear. With all that's going on in the world, this is a time of disorientation. This is a time of people in need. And we are EO, and as EO, we stand together. I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel Friedland. Daniel is an expert on the science of leadership, wellness, resiliency, and he's authored one of the first textbooks on evidence-based medicine. Daniel has been a guest at EO Eccentric, and he also joined us in Hawaii for the Regional Leadership Academy recently, just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, where he shared his information in depth. What I'd like to do is Daniel has amazing content that he has delivered to EO over this past year, and I've asked him to distill his content down to the real core of what it is. And really get down into practical tips of how to navigate in this time of stress and fear. It's very ambitious for him to get through the material that he's going to get through. Please buckle up. We're going to let him run for about 30 to 45 minutes. We will get into Q&A. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A channel. But Daniel, this is your book. From my perspective, it really is a masterpiece. It's changed my life in the way that I look at stress and fear and my own internal leadership. Please tell us what it's about. We're passing to you.
Right on, Michelle. Hey, well, I just want to say how much I appreciate you, Michelle, and our friendship and the community. The RLA community in being there with you in Hawaii was just so extraordinary. As I share, I want to acknowledge that coming together on Zoom is incredibly important for community, because we're in a time right now of just, with social distancing and with our fears that, many people in the EO community are going through tremendous hardship. And then we're actually locked down and you're going through this hardship alone. So it can be probably one of the most challenging times in our lives for many of us. And so, coming together in community is just wonderful, but I want to also acknowledge this level of disorientation. And so what we wanted to do over here today is provide some framework. So this is going to be more, instead of a conversation, which I usually do, most of my programs are conversations. Today, this is going to be more of a presentation, because what I want to do is Michelle has asked me to distill my day-long workshop into an hour to provide you the highlight reel, if you will, of the key takeaways that can help us lead well from inside ourselves right now, be able to navigate tremendous amount of stress, uncertainty, and self-doubt, and be able to kind of focus on what matters most. And I hope to be able to show you just how important this is to show up as our best version of our leadership right now, to be able to take care of ourselves, from that place, take care of others, take care of our clients, and with that comes immense possibility for growth through this time. So the work is called, is distilled down into leading well from within. And the notion is, if we want to lead well in the world, how do we lead well inside ourselves? The subtitle of the book is, it's essentially the science and practice of conscious leadership. And conscious leadership comes from the conscious capitalism community. And if you haven't heard of conscious capitalism is a big international movement that has been either founded or engaged by companies like Starbucks, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, Best Buy, Patagonia, Southwest Airlines. And all of these organizations have come together to say, we see the greatest possibility for social transformation coming out of business organizations, or non-profit organizations. And I believe that. And their mission statement is ambitious. They say, we exist to elevate humanity. And if ever there was a time that we needed to figure out how do we actually elevate humanity, now's the time. And they run all 4 principles. And I'm showing you these principles because my experience of being with you at EO Eccentric and the Regional Leadership Academy is you are essentially embodying conscious capitalism already. So I'm putting a framework around what you're already doing. So the first thing is, and I'm thinking about when Warren speaks about get up in the morning, connect with your purpose. The first tenet is higher purpose drives. Higher purpose drives, then it's making sure that all stakeholders in the ecosystem are well represented. And then it's about conscious leadership that drives conscious culture and a thriving environment. And Raj Sodya co-founded the organization with John Mackey, who's the CEO of Whole Foods. Raj wrote a beautiful book called Firms of Endearment and tracked 28 companies over a 15-year period and found these companies outperformed the S&P by 10 to 1. And the question was, how's that possible? And so what I became intensely interested in is the science and practice of this. And so when I put this work together on Leading Well from Within, essentially it's a neuroscience and mindfulness-based framework for conscious leadership. So I wanted to understand this from a place of biology. And what I want to share with you over here is an understanding of how is your brain work, particularly now when you're in times of immense amount of stress. So in essence, the brain, there are a number of ways of organizing the concept, the learning around the brain. One of the concepts I find very helpful here is a concept called the triune brain. It's an evolutionary model of the brain where the brain develops from the bottom up and the back forward. In fact, you can use a hand model of your brain over here, where this base over here is it's the brain stem. And this over here is pretty much about safety and survival, fight and flight. And the brain prioritizes safety first. All the senses come in through safety first. That's called the reptilian brain. Then as we move up, next level is called the paleo-mammalian brain, because as mammals, we do something different. We nurture our young. So in addition to many, many functions over here, the paleo-mammalian brain, and also known as the limbic system, has a lot to do with pair bonding and nurturing. And so this is a part of the brain that begins to give rise to our capacity for love and belonging and social cooperation. And then this top part of the brain over here, and particularly the front part, the newest part in evolution behind our forehead, essentially gives us our capacity for high performance leadership. This is a part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that really gives us the capacity for wisdom. So it gives us the capacity for emotional composure. It gives us the ability to relate well to others. It gives us the ability to achieve our results with good decision-making and willpower to follow through on the decisions we make. And it also gives us the capacity for mindfulness, where we can step back and look at the thought streams of our mind and say, hey, there goes a damn crazy thought today. Am I going to act on that one? So essentially what happens is the brain architects itself as a genius engineering system reflected by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So our brain is architected, and this is why Maslow is so sticky, because Maslow's biology simplified yet at 3 levels, the levels of safety, belonging, and significance. And here's what happens. There are flows that happen in the brain, flows that happen. And when demands exceed resources and we experience threat around stress and self-doubt, we plummet down into a safety frame and go into a reactive mindset. And by the way, the gravitational pull down here is incredibly strong because these are the strongest circuits in our brain. Now, at this point in time, the demands in our life have never been higher. On the background of the high demands we're already facing, now you've got coronavirus disease that's leading to tremendous, disruption, disorientation, and really fragmenting all of the resources, a lot of the resources that we rely on to be able to actually rise to our challenge. And so we're in a time really where we've tipped. So when demands exceed resources, we go down into a safety frame, into reactivity. Some of that is adaptive. Some of that is adaptive, meaning, yes, this is absolutely the crucial time to be focused on our physiological safety needs and really make sure that we're doing all the precautions we can to mitigate against the coronavirus infections, the contagion. And then we need to also kind of pay particular attention to, essentially, literally the basics of our survival is that kind of food and shelter and viability of our businesses going forward. So that's all very adaptive. But at the same time, what can happen is that we can become, this safety is a sledgehammer. So when we're down here, we also see ourselves going into fight and flight responses psychologically. So when we're threatened by stress, we may find ourselves fighting for control or taking flight from things that leave us feeling out of control. Or if we're threatened by self-doubt, we may be fighting to prove self-worth or just stepping away, taking flight from anything that triggers self-doubt. And when we go into that, that can intensify, essentially, it can actually degrade our relationships. You know, it can cause edginess and frustration at home, and you may be experiencing, you know, stress, tremendous stress, you know, with family members and kids. And by the way, that's understandable because your brain's going here. And then when we're in this place, this reactive mindset, this can actually also take us when we're, you know, overly responding to fight and flight responses. This puts us into really a low performance leadership state. And interestingly, Drucker has just a wonderful quote, Peter Drucker. He says, all organizations are a mix of friction, confusion, and low performance. Everything else requires leadership. And what he's saying is that ultimately our natural tendency, even in the best of times, is to actually move towards this fight and flight response because of the stickiness of our brain. And then he says, everything else requires leadership. And this is so incredibly important. Leaders at this time, you know, at this time, how do we show up? How do we find a sense of psychological safety? How do we bring people together in a place of love and belonging? How do we help, you know, all of those who we care for at home and in business to reorient continually to what matters most now, to be able to move up in the flow of purpose and significance? And by the way, that's going to be really, really important for the long haul, because I think we're in this for at least for months and, you know, possibly longer. And if this goes on for months where we're actually feeling threatened with stress and self-doubt for months, but we become exhausted. Daniel Goleman would call that amygdala hijack. We forgo love and belonging, feel disconnected, or we actually lose a sense of this, you know, accomplishment, you know, personal accomplishment. So when we plummet into that, we can be left with exhaustion, disconnection, a reduced sense of accomplishment. That is the classic diagnosis or triad of burnout. Burnout, that's burnout. And burnout overlaps with depression as well. So just anticipate that if you find yourself moving into stages of burnout and depression, you're not weak, you're not flawed. This is what the brain does naturally when demands are high and resources are low. It does this. So you are well connected with everybody else. So the opportunity over here is an opportunity for growth. If we step in and we say, okay, this is a moment of incredible disruption. How do I as a leader take care of myself? How do I find psychological safety within myself? How do I find a deeper sense of connection with myself? How do I connect with my purpose? What will come out of this time is you will build resiliency. Instead of what can happen with post-traumatic stress, you will actually experience post-traumatic growth. So the other part about leadership and conscious leadership is this. It's an understanding that we don't only oscillate between these reactive and creative mindsets by ourselves. What we experience is that when we look at ourselves as leaders, leadership is an act of influence. Leadership is an act of influence. We're wired to connect. We're wired to connect. So the insight from that is, think about all these areas that your life, that you're influential in, which is both at work, at home, with your friends and your community. In other words, you have influence all over the show. So leadership's not a role, it's a way of being. And then there's this insight that leadership being an act of influence, you cannot not have influence. And the only question is, are you having positive influence in your environment, or are you having negative influence in your environment? And so when you look at that, there's this understanding that inevitably we are either in not only in reactivity and creativity within ourselves, but we're in these two cycles, the cycle of reactivity or a cycle of creativity at this time. And the cycle of reactivity is this. If you've got a partner, a colleague who's in a state of a lot of fight and flight edginess, that's very likely to trigger your stress and self-doubt. You may go edgy and then further trigger them. And you can find yourself in this endless loop of fight, flight, trigger, you know, just going around and around. On the other hand, as a conscious leader, can we break that cycle? How do we break that cycle and actually enter a state of being where we can learn how to actually fundamentally receive and give with love, give and receive with love and care? How do we receive others with empathy and understanding so we don't see their reactive defenses? What we actually see is the suffering below that. We receive them in a different way and then give them a greater leeway and space and kindness to give them, our care and compassion, and the opportunity to receive that so we can find ourselves into this cycle of receiving and giving. And I've seen so much of that happening in EO already. I've seen so much of that happening in EO already. Maybe I'm putting a framework around what you're already experiencing. And the idea over here is that we're in a cycle of fight, flight, trigger, we're actually plummeting down here into the safety frame. And over the long haul, we actually are facilitating burnout. On the other hand, if we're actually in the cycle of receiving and giving with others, if we're able to enter that space, we're actually moving up here, creating psychological safety, reconnecting with others with a love and compassion. And then that gives us the opportunity to help ourselves focus on what matters most from that important platform. And that provides us with resiliency. So at this point, you may be reflecting on, well, what do we do with this foundational understanding? And I certainly hope this has been helpful to you to reflect on, but I'm going to invite you to think about what would you want to know now in terms of what do we do with this? What do we do with this insight? And so I want to shift over here into talking about what are the practical skills and tools essentially for elevation. When we're talking about, when conscious capitalism says we exist to elevate humanity, and they talk about conscious leadership, that's a Maslowian construct. It's a Maslowian construct that asks us, how can we lead from our higher self in this time of needs? When everybody is plummeting to safety, how can we be the individuals that are there in an island of stability to be able to uplift others? And it's an extraordinary opportunity to grow our relationship with ourselves, with our family, with our clients, so we come through this even stronger. The foundation of this process is mindfulness. When you talk about conscious leadership, it's mindfulness. So I define mindfulness as a practice of paying attention with a sense of openness, kindness, and curiosity for what's ever arising in the present moment. This is a moment-to-moment experience. It's not a big conceptual thing. It's how are you showing up now? How are you showing up now? And these qualities of instilling these qualities in our lives are so, so key. So let me break this phrase down. Mindfulness is a practice of paying attention. Let me just start with that line. This is a huge shift. This is a huge shift. There's these concepts, the higher the altitude, the greater the leverage. So I want to give you a very high altitude concept that has tremendous leverage in transforming your life. So the first thing is, where do you orient yourself to the experience of your life? Or where do you assign your core identity? And the metaphor in the background over here is, of mindfulness is that it's an experience of clouds passing across the sky. In other words, there's a difference between the context of our experience and the content of our experience. So the content of our experience is the thoughts, sensations, and feelings that we're having. This is akin to the weather changing over here, and you may be buffeted in the rain as storms brew. And so, for example, the thoughts that might happen is like, oh my God, I'm just like falling apart over here. What's wrong with these other people? Why are they not sure? Why is my wife or my husband so edgy? Why are my kids unruly? So we're going into all of this thought stream, or maybe the self or the doubt, which is like, what's wrong with me? So I would say that's a weather pattern. So it's like, and the language is akin to, I'm frustrated, I am sad, I am anxious, I am hopeless, I am worthless. And there's not a lot of option until the weather changes. But when you elevate to the clarity of the sky itself, everything changes. You begin to say things like, I'm noticing that I'm having angry thoughts and feelings. I'm noticing those thoughts that I'm frustrated with my partner. I'm noticing those thoughts where I'm actually having tremendous self-doubt right now. And there is a world of difference between that orientation, Because the moment you get into the noticing of the clarity of the sky and you assign your quality there, you create a stability of mind. And what you create most profoundly is you create choice. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, says between stimulus and response, there's a gap. In that gap is my power to choose. And when you elevate to your higher cortical circuits and your prefrontal cortex over here, what you begin to do is to be able to see your experiences and then say, okay, I'm super angry right now. Is this helpful or harmful? And how would I actually want to show up? It gives you the ability to choose without being as entangled in your thoughts. Then the next quality is on that quality of paying attention from a place of the witnessing observer. To bring in, if you think about this as a lens, the qualities and really kind of live the qualities through this lens of awareness, the observation, wearing the lens of openness. And openness ultimately gives you a deeper sense of safety. You may actually find tremendous resistance, like I'd prefer not to feel this way, or I prefer not, these things weren't happening. But the openness is, I prefer it wasn't, but it is what it is. I have the strength to stand in the presence of what is. And interestingly, that gives you a deeper sense of safety. It's the resistance that actually, of the reality that actually makes us feel unsafe. So that helps you feel safe. The kindness connects you with your love and belonging needs and gives you the courage to lean in. And the curiosity, the insatiable curiosity, which is what best serves next, that elevates you to a place of significance. So with that, mindfulness moment to moment is a practice of elevation. Mindfulness moment to moment is a practice of elevation. And ultimately, mindfulness is essentially the power to notice and choose. The power to notice and choose. So at every moment, no matter what's happening, you get to step back and actually notice what's going on and choosing your response. The ground zero we're talking about, many people are talking about ground zero of the virus. That's an irrelevant conversation as far as I'm concerned. The more profound question we need to be asking ourselves is, what is ground zero for our response? What is ground zero for our response within? And every moment is an opportunity to step into your ground zero with the power to notice and choose, to be able to choose your effective response. So I want to give you, shift from there on that foundation. This is usually like literally a 2-day workshop. I'm going to distill now into about 10 minutes. And I just want to give you some, just some bite-sized chunks of a process I put in place for you that's called the 4-in-4 framework to engage conscious leadership. It's a 4-step process that helps you proactively shift between a reactive mindset and a creative mindset using scientifically proven skills and practices for doing so. And I'm going to go through this quickly, but I want to really reassure you that if you want to go into the depth of this, I put everything into my book. I didn't write my book as a marketing piece. I wrote it because I wanted you to have everything in your hands that could empower you to actually kind of create the transformation that you would want if this resonates and feels meaningful for you. So the first step over here is you cannot effectively navigate your reactivity unless you can recognize it first. So this first step is the ability to fundamentally recognize your reactive sensations, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and to ask yourself, am I in a place of safety right now, in a reactive mindset? And the key question over here is, in recognizing that you've gone into a reactive mindset, based on the spade work of looking at your sensations, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and that represents a reactive signature, to then ask yourself the key question, because sometimes that reactive mindset it can be very adaptive, can be very helpful. But to ask yourself the question, when you notice these sensations, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, these reactive experiences, to ask yourself, are these experiences doing me and others more harm than good? And if they are, these are the 4 components that can help you manage your reactivity. And so the process is called the 4-in-4 framework because there are 4 steps to this process, and then each step has 4 components to it, hence that framing of it. So These are the 4 steps to manage reactivity. First step is to pause. And the reason is that our brain is fast reactive, slow wise. Fast reactive, slow wise. So by pausing, you give your wise brain a chance to catch up. Then next, breathe. A lot of our reactive creative equilibrium is run by our autonomic nervous system. And when we get very stressed, we step on the gas, activating something called the sympathetic nervous system, putting us into fight and flight activation. You can hack that physiology by tapping the brake, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. And the way we do that is we simply learn how to activate it through diaphragmatic breathing. So ultimately, let it, because the biggest nerve, vagus nerve, innervates the diaphragm. So if you just know how to do diaphragmatic breathing, you can hack that physiology and calm that response. And so the way that you do that is, for example, would be breathing in perhaps a little slower and then breathing out even slower, and maybe putting a little bit of pressure out behind your exhalation. We activate the parasympathetics primarily on our out breath. So this is what that would look like. It would look like something like this. 4 seconds in, maybe 5 or 6 seconds out. And you can see I'm blowing out like I'm blowing out through a straw. Make the belly soft. Let the belly go. Make it soft. And if you do 3 to 6 breaths like that, you'll begin to put yourself into you'll begin to moderate with your parasympathetics to tap the brakes and feel greater emotional composure. This third component comes out of the science that when people actually have been put in MRI scanners and they look at scary faces, it activates the amygdala when they look at scary faces. And it's been found that if you actually name your experience, you activate your prefrontal cortex and you deactivate the amygdala. That's triggering a lot of the anxious response. And so we called it name it to tame it. And what naming does is it actually puts you in the sky again. So the naming sounds like something like catching yourself saying, there's anger. Ooh, there's irritation, there's frustration. You're putting yourself into the sky. And that'll calm you down as well. And then consider your best response. Consider your best response. And actually, some of this best response is actually just taking a break. Because if you're hungry, thirsty, or tired, and many of us people are on Zoom all day long, getting really frazzled, just to remember to step up, move your body, go get some nourishment, get a little bit of rest before you come to your next call. And that'll actually put you in a better state. And then asking the question, what best serves now? So that's recognizing a taste of recognizing and managing your reactivity. This next piece over here is, can we reframe our experience with stress and self-doubt? And in the book, what I've done is I've given you the ability to reframe your experience with stress, to reframe your experience with self-doubt, and to reframe your experience with the triggers. But I'm just going to give you a brief taste on the power of reframing. Again, you'll find that all in the book if you want to dig down in that. But I want to give you a brief taste on how we reframe our experience with stress at this point in time, which is a very, very stressful time. So over here, in terms of reappraising stress, I would ask you right now, just to take a moment to reflect, are you experiencing your stress as a demand or a resource? Are you experiencing your stress right now as a demand or a resource? Many of us are experiencing stress as a demand right now. And I'm going to show you that it could be both. You could be experiencing it as both. And the insight over here is that we don't have one kind of stress response. We have multiple kinds of stress responses. And so there are at least 3 stress responses that map to different levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Here's the classic fight and flight response that's called the threat response. And this puts us into essentially a fight, which is very adaptive to save your life. But if you're fighting and taking flight with others, we may be also doing more harm than good. And certainly with the vasoconstriction and the rise of cortisol, we're also ravaging our body. It's unhealthy for us. And that actually, at this time of actually kind of this response can actually make us more, it can degrade our immune response and make us more susceptible to infections as well. Next, there's another response. So the tend and befriend response is when we get stressed, we don't only release cortisol, we also release oxytocin. Oxytocin is a stress hormone. So when we get stressed, you may have an experience that there's a part of you that wants to fight and flight or get aggressive or isolate, but there's another part of us that wants to call a friend. That thread in you that wants to call a friend is activating the tend and befriend response. And the question is, which stream do we swim within right now? And then you've got this response, which is a high performance stress response. High performance stress response. This response is like, I am amped, but rather than trying to manage your stress of energy, you're using every ounce of that energy in service of the outcomes that matter most. Saying, man, I'm amped, let's go. And when you do that, the science shows that you don't constrict your blood vessels, you dilate them, you get more blood to the brain. And this has been associated with all kinds of high performance outcomes. All kinds of outcomes, business negotiation, academic performance, athletic achievement, pilots landing planes in flight simulation, engine failures. That may be a good simulation for the stress we're going through right now in this massive turbulence, right? And so ultimately, or even recovery from childhood trauma. So again, talking about this is a state that puts us into a place of receptivity for post-traumatic growth. So the question you may ask right now is, how can I leverage this insight to move from my threat response to a challenge response? And here's the formula for doing that. The formula is this. What is the relationship of the demands you're facing in your life to the resources you have to engage? And when demands exceed resources, this is what's happening. We cave under threat. So again, I want to just point out that if you feel like you're here caving under threat, this is not a weakness, this is not a flaw, this is biology. And just for the compassion of actually understanding that ultimately, we're in a high demand situation and a low resource thing. So give yourself the understanding of how predisposed we are to actually a feeling that we're caving under threat right now. On the other hand, how do we rise to the challenge? And in that part of the formula, this is the place where actually our resources exceed the demands that we're facing. In other words, we have the capacity to become first and foremost more internally resourceful. And that in the time of inner work, and many of us at home alone, rather than being internally focused, this is the time to ask the key question. How can I actually become more internally resourceful? It's an incredible opportunity for work. And then when we connect more fully with others, we understand, how can I actually marshal greater connectivity to more fully marshal external resources, and then the systems. Right now we're moving a lot of things virtual, into the virtual environment. How do we actually leverage those systems to rise to the challenge as well? And so the question over here is, when I asked early on, do you experience stress as a demand or a resource? What if you could, you experience a demand, what if you could actually change and reframe your experience with stress and move it to the resource side of your equation? And actually the researchers at Stanford show that this is easier to do than you imagine. And this comes down to a matter of definition. So what's your definition of stress? Based on the early definitions of stress in healthcare, most people actually have a definition of stress. Can I cope? Can I handle this? And the challenge is when you find yourself stressed, you're saying, geez, I can't cope. And we feel weak. So we're not only stressed, but we're feeling stressed about being stressed. What the researchers have shown is if you change your definition of stress to one that's more accurate, you change the game. So I want to offer you this definition of stress based on the work of Alia Crum and Kelly McGonigal at Stanford. Stress is what arises when something you care about is at stake. Think about that for a moment. Stress is what arises when something you care about is at stake. What this means when you step back mindfully and you look at your stress, what you appreciate is you don't get stressed because you're weak. You get stressed because you give a damn, because you care. And think about all those areas in your life that you really care about. Think about the stress you're having with your family. Think about the stress you're having with your business. All of that is because you care. And so the question is not how am I going to get rid of the stress, but how am I going to use my stress in service of what I care about? And so I've created a 4-component response to this. with a mnemonic, let's get real with stress. Let's get real. So this first component is recognize it. And then to remember to embrace it. Remember to embrace it. Realizing that stress is mobilizing because we're caring about something. So it's energy that's in service of us. It's an asset and a friend. And then remembering to ask the better question. Typically, the questions we ask when we get stressed is, how can I get rid of my stress? And the answer comes back, second bottle of Chardonnay. Or, more sadly, how can I become more indifferent about what I care about? That to me is the sadder response. As opposed to asking the question, what is it that I really care about right now? And what are the smallest steps that I can take right now in alignment with what I care about? And then the L is leveraging the energy of that to take those steps. So what you have, what we've covered in the first two steps is, first was how we recognize and managing our reactivity, and then how we reframe our experience with stress and self-doubt. And those two steps give you a greater capacity for stress mastery. This third step over here is important. So what are we navigating towards? What really matters over here? And this actually kind of gets into looking at what reorients us and what is the recipe for a flourishing life. So this gets into the world of positive psychology. How do we like to learn? How do we like to connect? How do we like to best express ourselves? What's our best service? And then how do we create the freedom and opportunity to live that, out of which comes an experience of significance and the ability to leave a legacy? Now I've got a 4-component process over here that we won't have time to go, in great depth into right now, but it's a process that I call vision, strategy, implementation, and results that can help you optimize your health, which is so important at this time, your relationships, and essentially your stream of engagement to give you greater meaning, significance, effectiveness, and productivity at work. So the fourth step, so these first two steps help you navigate stress. This step helps you focus on what really matters most. The most important step of all is this. It's the internal work around what catalyzes growth. And this gets into what catalyzes growth is this understanding that a lot of this work simply comes down to, can I optimize my relationship with myself and others? And essentially that optimization resides in conversation. It resides in conversation. So here we're asking ourselves, what is the quality of my internal conversation that feeds into my external conversation? And by the way, because we're wired to connect, your internal conversation becomes, as a leader, becomes socially and emotionally contagious. Your internal conversation as a leader becomes socially and emotionally contagious. So what is the quality of questions, essentially? How are we optimizing our internal thought stream? And part of what I'm sharing here is I've discovered, Michel shared that I wrote one of the early textbooks on evidence-based medicine, which is a scientific process by which all doctors are now trained to make science-based decisions. So it's actually at large play going on right now in the healthcare system in this time of need. But I have actually found that a way to actually leverage that same process that helps us navigate scientific uncertainty to navigate personal uncertainty and catalyze internal growth. And this process is the process of same 4 steps of knowing how can you ask a better question inside yourself. Instead of asking the question, let me bring it back. This process is ask, find, evaluate, and apply. Instead of asking the question, what if in every catastrophe that could happen? Or what's wrong with me? What's wrong with other people? If we begin to discipline our questions in alignment with our recipe for a flourishing and more purposeful life, we ask different questions. So this is a reminder to actually ask different questions, such as, instead of what's wrong with me, what's wrong with others, we can remember to ask questions like, difficult moment. In this moment, what's it I'm here to learn? What's I'm here to learn? How can I better connect with myself, with others, and my higher source of inspiration? How can I best express myself? What's my highest purpose and service in this moment? And then what will happen is, as you ask those questions, your ability to then find that stillness inside whether it be breathing, as I showed you early on, going out for a jog, whatever it takes for you, having a hot shower, whatever it takes for you to get to a place of stillness, holding open that space so that the answers to your inspired questions can find you, and then have a way of actually feeling into the moment. Does this feel right more than it feels good? Because ultimately, you know, limbic, we're always looking for relief, but looking at, what feels right over here, even if I'm scared? What feels right? And actually trusting those answers that come. And then the apply piece is the courage to take action in the stream of that inspiration. And then you loop back around asking the next question, which is what I'm doing working? Is what I'm doing working? And if it is, if it isn't working, ask more questions. If it is working, this is the opportunity to give in tremendous appreciation for whatever you describe is the source of inspiration that's guiding that inner wisdom. For me, it's my act of faith in God. So I take incredible source of strength and comfort in this time in my faith, and trusting when I'm asking questions and I'm listening quietly, that I feel, you know, it's connecting to the collective consciousness of wisdom in the world. So let me pivot over here right now, and I'm just doing a time check because I want to give you a way. A lot of this is how not only how do you coach yourself up to shift from a reactive to a creative mindset, but now how do you practically coach others to do the same? What are the skills and tools that we can leverage? Let me ask you, Michel, should I keep going on this?
It was the first question I was going to ask. I would love for you to share about the peer coaching so that EOers can help one another.
Yeah, and I know that's the great strength of EO. The great strength of EO is peer coaching. So I want to give you a structure for doing this as well.
Thank you.
This is Maslowian as well. And so it comes down to, again, what are the quality of questions we're asking? So the first thing is, if somebody calls you, I can't overstate this. The first thing to do is to listen with empathy and compassion, to hold a place for somebody to share their story. That's like the first part. You've got to claim the ground of care and compassion first, before you go into the ground of significance to actually help somebody fundamentally self-coach themselves. This is not about consulting. This is about effective coaching, is about helping individuals self-coach themselves and trusting they have capacity. And then when you get to that place in the coaching after listening, it's the way we frame our questions. So I want to kind of give you a macro on this. Very often, we take a deficit problem-solving approach around challenges. So this is kind of a problem-solving approach where we identify a problem and then we analyze the causes and we identify solutions, we fix the problem. The problem with that approach is that actually, even as you're working through and you're analyzing the causes, some people get mired in safety because they feel blamed. So you're not activating their strengths. Whereas a different approach has a different promise. And this gets us into the world of appreciative inquiry, as how extraordinarily, you know, what extraordinary unlocking of collective wisdom and capacity this offers. And so here is what Drucker, another beautiful quote from Drucker, says the task of leadership is to create an alignment of strengths, making a system of weaknesses irrelevant, even in times like this. Or shall I say, especially in times like this, activating capacity. And so the way of activating capacity is strengths-based, and the steps of appreciative inquiry, once you define a general question, which is something like, how can I actually tap into my deepest source of resiliency to help myself and others around me thrive? So starting with that, defining that question, you then go into an abundant, you know, instead of a deficit-based gap, an abundance gap, unlocking strengths to get there. And so the first part is discovering the purpose and the strengths you already have for doing so. And then it's about dreaming of a better future. And then it's about designing strategic initiatives and deploying action steps to make it so. So the flow over here is appreciative inquiry is the best of what was, is, and could be. And so these are the questions. So this is the cycle of appreciative inquiry. And these are all of the organizations that have been using this for years. So it's a well-traveled track. You know, United Nations, Google, Apple, you know, Starbucks, and you know, all of these other companies. It's since the 1980s. This is the work of David Cooperrider. I learned this process through a group called the Exchange Process. Very, very powerful, very powerful. And so these, what's called the 4D, or if you throw in the define piece, the 5D model is represented with 6 foundational questions. So when you're talking to somebody and you're helping them discover purpose. Why does learning how to become more resilient at this point in time, why does that matter to you? Why does that matter to your family? Why does that matter to your colleagues? And why does this matter to the world at large? In other words, how can I be a vector of not physical contagion, but how can I be a vector of social and emotional contagion at a time where the world needs it more than ever? Then we go into what's called discovering the best of the past. So what has been most successful in the past? What has been most successful in the past? So what you're doing over here, you're looking at the question, when have I been at a time, in my life, my business, where I've been up against it like I am right now? What's been most successful in the past? And then you're discovering the best of the present. What does that reveal to me about the current strengths I have? So you're actually now awakening capacity. You're awakening the strengths you already have to go through this. And here's what's profound. The way you are showing up right now, because this involves the question of discovering the best of the past, you are building a future memory of the resilience you're creating now that will help you be resilient for the future. And what I mean by that is 5 years from now, when you come back and ask the question, have I been up against a time when I've actually had this happen now? You'll remember in the past, 5 years from now, you remember, well, if I got through the time of coronavirus, I can get through everything. I can get through anything. So the way you show up now is building insurance and inoculation for resiliency for your future. And then you're asking, okay, what are those current strengths? And from that place of strengths, you now are reimagining or dreaming of your best future. What is your vision of success from the foundation of those flourishing strengths? And then you move into designing the strategic initiatives and deploying the action steps that will help you achieve specific, measurable, vision-aligned, realistic, and time-frame results. And so, stripping this back, these are the questions of significance that help you elevate the conversation within yourself and with others. And so when you're coaching somebody calls you and says, you know what, I'm struggling, I'm really struggling, just invite them to tell their story. And you can use all of these 6 questions, or you can use some of them. And you can trust yourself and use them in any order that you feel is appropriate. Rather listening to the conversation than get scripted on this. Trust, this is backdrop. This is backdrop. But be in the process of presence and emergence when you're speaking with others, when you're connecting with others. And so somebody will share their story, and they will actually share like their fears and their difficulty. And then you ask the question, okay, once they've been heard, so you'll feel at this place in the conversation when people have been very stressed and they've told their story, essentially by letting them tell their story in a container of compassion, you're letting them do a massive name entertainment. So when somebody tells their story, they're rising into the sky. And so just that alone is going to bring their stress level down. It's a huge service. That alone on peer coaching is a game changer. And then when you begin to be surgical with the question, you're not giving the answers, you're framing the discussion where people can define the answers for themselves based on the capacity that they have. You're basically presuming you already have capacity when you speak to them. You already have capacity. Let me actually help remind you of the capacity you have. You're bringing them back online into their prefrontal cortex. So you ask, right now, what are the outcomes matter most to you and why? Can you think of a time in the past where you've really been up against it? Can you look at a time when you've really been up against it and you've come through? What does that reveal to you about your current strengths? And when you come back to, what would you like to see, unfold for yourself in the situation? What then are the smallest steps you could take right now to move you, inch your way along to those outcomes that you want to see? What are the smallest steps you can do to break that? So you make that feasible. You help them make that feasible because they may be overwhelmed. And then you ask, what other resources do you need to make that happen? And how can I be our best support? That to me is a model for effective peer coaching that leverages the wisdom of appreciative inquiry. So I know we've got some, a good little bit of time left. What I'd love to do is I'd love to share, Michel, should we share a little bit about what we did in Hawaii together now?
I think so. That's just what I was going to ask you to go into. You're reading my mind.
Okay, right on, Michel. So first of all, I had such joy working with Charles Bender and Michel on designing this experience for the Regional Leadership Academy in Hawaii. Actually, this was the last live event that I did, and I suspect I'm going to do for a while. And it was so glorious, the joy that we had in conceiving this, because what I did in the morning, we were in a surf bar, and I shared an expanded version of what I shared with you over here in that surf bar. It was in the realm of conversation and interactive exercises. It was so cool. People were switched on, and the amount of engagement and energy in that room was unbelievable. And then what we wanted to do was we wanted to leverage an experience that actually took advantage of the fact we were in Hawaii. So we actually took this process into the water. And it was really a baptism. And what I mean by a baptism, we took 3 of these key questions over here. And I had no idea at the time how powerful these 3 questions were going to be for not only the group in this carrying forward in terms of just how much has happened in the weeks since, but hopefully what this means in terms of you taking inspiration for yourself in these questions right now for yourself in terms of what we asked. So what we did was we created an experience where I'll go through, I want to give you a place, I'm going to come back to the slide. We took the process into the water. We took the process into the water, and everybody went in to the water with essentially this. In other words, rising with your core strength or your superpower. And we asked 3 questions that we group processed in the water. And so these were the questions that we asked. And I'm going to ask you, if you've got a pen and paper available, to write down these key questions, because, as we transition off this call, I would love for you to be able to actually think deeply into, if I could offer you, for your reflection, what is the deepest superpower you can activate right now based on awakening the strengths you have right now? So what is it that you can activate for yourself right now? And so these 3 questions are essentially reflect and share a high point experience where you had to swim out in choppy water, and against all odds you broke through. And boy, are we in choppy water right now. We're in choppy water right now. What were the key strengths or values? Second question. What were the key strengths or values that helped you to succeed? And then if you were to choose one superpower, that you can now reliably turn to support your current vision moving forward, especially at this challenging time, what would the success factor be? What's the core for you? And so here's what the exercise looked like. And I want to invite you into an experience and imagine that you were there with us. Imagine that you were there with us and we're going through this experience together. And so essentially we had about 35 or 40 leaders line up on the beach with paddle boards. We then paddled out and we got into the groups of about six or 7, in which everybody shared the answers to these questions. And then what we did was we got into a large paddle circle. I blew a whistle. Everybody then assembled in a circle. Now this is, when I talk about paddle circles, typically we do a paddle circle when somebody in the surfing community has died. And this is our way of honoring their life and death. This paddle circle wasn't about death, it was about birth. It was essentially the baptism of actually birthing and awakening, an even greater awakening of the strength that you have to face any challenges that you do. And then we did a closing circle on the beach afterwards. So I want to share with you some videos, hopefully that you put yourself there and you give yourself the opportunity to imagine you're in one of these groups, sharing, and then distilling that, and then you get into sharing in the larger group. So here is us. Here's where we're paddling out. So imagine you're paddling out now. All right, so you've just paddled out and now you've assembled into your groups of 6 or 7. So imagine you're in the group and you're doing the experience share to share your answers to these 3 questions. You're right there with us. All right. And now imagine you've assembled with us, that you're sitting in our paddle circle group and that you're in the loop of about to share out or, declare what your superpower is. And I'm going to invite you to listen very, very closely to the superpowers that are being shared around the group, and to actually each one of those that you hear, write that down, because that also may create resonance that helps you crystallize your superpower further. So write down each one of these superpowers that you've heard, and this is going to take about 2 minutes. So I'm just going to want you to just really experience yourself as being there.
Yeah! My superpower is building and defending culture. My superpower is enabling others. My superpower is positivity. My superpower is tenacity. My superpower is relationship building. My superpower is going higher and higher. Nice! My superpower is determination. My superpower is resilience for freedom. Nice. My superpower is mindfulness. My superpower is analysis and execution. My superpower is never giving up. My superpower is excellent vision. My superpower is... My superpower is viewing stress positively. Beautiful. My superpower is determination. My superpower is positivity. My superpower is promoting clarity. My superpower is rising under any conditions. My superpower is empathy. My superpower is creativity. My superpower is inspiring others. My superpower is mindset. My superpower is teamwork and patience. My superpower is self-belief. Nice. My superpower is being resourceful. My superpower is consistency. My superpower is trusting that there's always a way forward. My superpower is My superpower is managing every challenge. My superpower is acceptance. My superpower is Okay, we'll go back to the beach and we'll get in a circle there as well. Okay.
So the power of that was so immense. One of the things that we experienced when we all linked arms together, when waves came through, initially when we were assembling, people were knocked off their boards. But the bigger the circle got and the fact that we were all linked, we were stronger together. So the metaphor of actually not only actually having the superpowers, but being linked together with our superpowers to promote emotional and social contagion is extraordinarily powerful.
Danny, thank you so much for your time. Your contact information was there at the end. This has been a real honor to have you here. We really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you for helping us to figure out how to deal with all that we're dealing with stress and fear at this time. And if anyone needs to reach you, there's your contact information. Any final word to bring us home, Danny?
Yeah, this is a time, and I just want to, say, just this great wish, to lead well from inside yourself, to lead well from within, to take better care of yourself, your loved ones, your friends, your clients, so we can all rise together. And the work that you're doing really, really matters now as leaders, really, really matters as leaders. And I take incredible comfort of the strength of EO to be a force for good in the world, to really ultimately elevate humanity.